So we'll first go through our introductions and then some new information that we want to share, and sort of the core new information we have is some projections about future conditions, future travel and traffic and other travel demand conditions in light of COVID recovery and the different ways that the economy and travel behavior could return in 2025 as we have a vaccine and start to return to pre-COVID activities. And we'll then break out into breakout rooms, small groups to discuss what this all could mean for the design and introduction of congestion pricing. And then we'll get back together as a group for report outs from the small groups. And there will be time for public comment at the end, 1 minute per person. So just some using Zoom information, PAC members, please do go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. And if you haven't already, update your name and organization in Zoom so that others can recognize the PAC members. Chats will be sent to the project team. We will be monitoring those chats and try to answer as many questions as we can. Here's the information that you can use to reach out to our team if you're having trouble. Abe or Paige in the chat if you can. If you can't, text our team at 415-930-3132. Next. On the phone, PAC members, if you're on the phone and need to introduce yourself, press *9 to raise your hand or *6 to mute. To unmute, mute and unmute. Okay, so for folks who may be coming to a PAC meeting for the first time, here's where the ground that the PAC has covered since it first started meeting before the pandemic. Which is when we started and when San Francisco had record levels of congestion. And so our board, SFCTA, San Francisco County Transportation Authority, which is made up of the Board of Supervisors, asked us to study how congestion pricing could be a potential tool to alleviate congestion and the related impacts of traffic on our streets around air quality, safety, and equity. We kicked off that study in 2019 and established this PAC to guide us through the process. We had just started our first round of outreach when the pandemic hit. And so we consulted with this committee, with our board, and the majority of folks encouraged us to continue on with the study, given that San Francisco's economy in the past has been resilient. So in years following an economic impact, the economy has returned stronger than before. And with that recovery, congestion is likely to continue or to return. So we're looking at congestion pricing as a tool to address congestion when the economy recovers. And that's a theme that we'll talk about today and get your insights on today. These questions about what does recovery look like? We have also, over the last few months since you last met, held some roundtables with the business community and with labor stakeholders, and we have heard your concerns from the business community in particular, including folks on this PAC, about the impact that the pandemic has had on businesses, especially those downtown. And we hear that loud and clear. And for this reason, in the breakout rooms, we want to talk about the timing of implementation. We know it's not now. We absolutely know that, but we want to ask, what does an equitable program look like in the right circumstances? So we know the future is uncertain. We might not need congestion pricing for another 5+ years, depending on what happens with the recovery, but that's what we're going to address today. So please keep that in mind as Drew. I hand this over to Drew, and he presents some forecasting and projecting work that we've done on that front. So now I'll hand it off to Drew. Thanks, Drew.
Thank you, Rachel. So over the last year, we had come to you all with our screening analysis, looking at basic performance of congestion pricing under a variety of different configurations. And then when we last met, we had introduced these kind of 3 alternatives that we thought illustrated some trade-offs to help get us towards this fair and equitable program design that Rachel is talking about. Over that same period of time, we have been living through COVID for a year now, and enough time has passed that we have been able to gather a bunch of data about kind of what's been going on over the last year, how it's changed over that period of time, as well as looking a little bit further back to the last couple of recessions that we've been through, to try to get a handle on what might happen next. And so we've done a lot of work to update our understanding about what we can expect in terms of population and job growth. We've taken into account changes that have happened to transit service, which was slashed pretty substantially following shelter in place and has kind of been incrementally restored in places since then with a new service coming up, particularly the Muni Metro tunnel and train service set to reopen. And COVID has also affected a bunch of factors related to the way that people move around the world. So people are working from home more, people are maybe avoiding transit to avoid being in closed small spaces with other people. And because of the restrictions on what we're allowed to do, which have been changing over time, people are also not doing all of the things that they used to do, or at least not doing them in the places and times that they used to do them, or at the same frequencies. So we have looked at all of these things and tried to make some reasonable assumptions about what we might expect going forward. However, there is a lot of uncertainty. So to start off, we looked back at historical population trends for the Bay Area. This chart looks back to 2005 and shows San Francisco as the dark green line and the region as the yellow line, and then the other counties are the kind of grayscale lines back there. So over this 14-year period, there's been pretty steady growth with a little bit of a dip following the 2008 recession in San Francisco, but then pretty steady after that, all the way up until about 2017, when growth in the city and really across the whole region had started to flatten off. And actually, San Francisco lost a little bit of population from 2017 to 2019. Over that same period of time, following 2010, job growth, particularly in San Francisco, was pretty robust and was growing at a very high rate all the way up to 2020, when it really fell off a cliff when we entered shelter in place. So now that we've entered a recession, we wanted to look back at the previous recessions to try to understand something about the range of possibilities that we might expect to see. And we learned that these two, as many of you probably already know, were pretty different from each other. The 2000 recession was much deeper and took a lot longer to kind of come back to the levels of population and employment that we had before. And the 2008 recession was several years worth of setback economically, but a quicker recovery. And when things started to recover, they came back faster. And so we're looking at that first at the 2000 recovery here in these charts. So the pink line here is San Francisco, and the blue line is the region, and you've got population on the left and jobs on the right. So following the 2000 recession, San Francisco's population dropped and stayed down for about 8 years before it recovered and grew past the levels that it was at before. On the job side, jobs dropped every year for 4 years and then started to recover, but they never really got back to where they were before we entered the next recession. So these new darker lines, these show trends for the 2008 recession. And here you can see that the San Francisco population took a little bit of a dip and then recovered pretty quickly. The job side took a little bit longer, but again, once you started to add jobs back, job growth was pretty robust after about 3 to 4 years. And these darkest lines are where we are now, or where we were as we approached the recession that started last year. So unlike the previous 2 recessions where population had been kind of on the rise leading into them, we were in a place where population was not really growing, and on the job side, whereas declines in jobs had kind of lagged the recession by a few years, here there's a pretty steep and immediate drop off, which rebounded somewhat later in the year, but not all the way by any means. So we took this information about the last recessions that we went through, and then we basically applied that going forward to say, what would it look like if this recovery looks like what we saw in 2000, and what would it look like if it followed more of a 2008 style trajectory? And that's what you're looking at here. So the lighter blue line is the 2000 style recovery. The darker blue line is a 2008 style recovery. And what we're recommending is this yellow line, which is really just looking back over the last 30 years of Bay Area population growth and projecting that going forward. And so that puts us kind of in the middle, which is reflective of the best data that we have about what's been happening in the region over the long term, and is not overly optimistic about how quickly it will recover, but not kind of overly pessimistic either. It's kind of a middle zone approach that we think is reasonable and conservative. On the jobs side, there is a bit more divergence. So again, the blue line on the bottom is the 2000 path. And you see that there is a drop off over the entire 10 years following the recession, with declines over the first 5 years and then starting to come back, but not making it all the way back 10 years out. With the 2008 style recovery, there's really a period of slower growth followed by a period of more rapid growth. And again, the recommended option that we have moved forward with is this 30-year growth trend, which puts us in between those two. We also looked at what has been happening with transit service to try to inform what we might expect to see 5 years and 10 years out in the future. And we did that with this framework where we started with what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? And what are some kind of options in the middle? So the worst case from our perspective was basically we're kind of stuck with what we have now. So there have been these transit service cuts, some service has been restored, and what if that's all we get for the next 5 years? That and Central Subway and Van Ness BRT, some of these big projects that are under construction and due to open in the next couple of years. At the other end of the spectrum, the best case is that we're totally back on track. All of the transit service that had been cut is restored, and it's been expanded as per previous plans. And so that's the kind of best case. And so what we've decided to work with is what we've described as a 5-year setback. So this basically says by 2025, we'll get back to where we were in 2020. And in addition to that, these big projects that are under construction will open up. We also thought through the changes in travel behavior that we've seen on the ground and tried to come up with our best recommendation for what we thought that might look like going forward. So the big elements here are working from home. And in San Francisco, about more than 50% of the population, the working population in San Francisco was able to work from home and was doing that during shelter in place. And transit avoidance, people were, we did a series of kind of a modeling exercise where we looked at all of the people working from home, all of the transit service cuts, all of the job losses, all of these restrictions on activity, and we observed that our model was still estimating that more people were riding transit than actually were. And so we actually used this model to kind of estimate what that effect of people's avoiding transit specifically because they don't want to be on transit with other people. And so that value is at its highest kind of in shelter in place. And then on the activity participation side, we've gone through a few swings of restrictions and easing restrictions and tightening of restrictions, and then now another round of easing restrictions. So when we're thinking about how these might play out in the future, when we're talking about transit avoidance, again, we're talking about a specific pattern of behavior around not wanting to be in enclosed spaces with other people. And as people are getting vaccinated in greater numbers, and as we come out of pandemic, we think that 5 years on, people are going to be going back to their old behaviors. They're not going to be afraid to get on trains anymore. And their decisions to get on trains and buses are going to be more driven by what transit service looks like and what the conditions on the roads are. Similarly, as restrictions ease and people are, again, vaccinated, we think people are going to be eager to go back to participating in the activities that they did, all the socializing and shopping and other things that people do. The thing that we thought might carry over, though, was this working from home. So we've been, again, more than half of the people working in San Francisco have been doing this for a year now, and we expect that people won't work from home at the levels that they are now, but it'll probably be higher than it was before. And so what we're recommending in our staff recommendation here is basically that an assumption that people that can work from home will do so about half of the time. So where does that put congestion pricing program in context of the analysis that we've showed you before and the targets that we've discussed before? Our screening analysis had calibrated prices and pricing structures around this target to reduce vehicle trips by 15% from the previous peak levels. That threshold is shown on this slide as the orange dotted line. The solid gray line shows first where we were before COVID, drops down to to show the number of vehicle trips to, from, and within the pricing zone that were happening in shelter in place. And then it climbs back up again as reflecting the reopening that had started to happen towards the end of last year. Using the assumptions about population growth, employment growth, transit service levels, and travel behavior that I just walked through, we think that that this amount of vehicle travel in the zone is going to basically follow this gray line. And where it ends up, as you can see, is still below this 15% threshold. And then where you see the colored lines branch off reflects the improvement over baseline conditions associated with these three alternatives. You can see that they're clustered pretty closely together. Now, while vehicle trip making is below this threshold that we have previously talked about, that doesn't mean that cars are necessarily zipping along downtown under these assumptions. So before COVID, speeds on downtown arterials were on average 14 miles an hour during the AM peak period. Without congestion pricing, by 2025, we expect speeds to be higher than that, but not a lot higher. We expect them to be at about 15 miles an hour, about 6% faster. There's a little bit more of an improvement on the highway side. So these outcomes reflect, as I had said before, our attempts to best understand what has been happening and what has happened in the past to make some informed guesses about what is going to happen in the future. But we did have to make a lot of assumptions, and as we saw in some of those earlier charts, those trends have from the previous recessions have diverged, and there are a divergent set of conditions that might happen going forward, and we don't really know which path we're on until we get there. And so these assumptions that we've made have uncertainty with relation to, how quickly or how slowly the population grows, how quickly or slowly the economy comes back, whether or not people do continue to work from home at higher rates, and transit service levels. Any one of those things might be different than what we have just talked about, and those differences can matter in the performance of a congestion pricing program. And so we're ingesting this information and talking to you all to try to understand better the conditions in which congestion pricing is needed, and how best to roll it out for the conditions that we might be facing at that time. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel or Paige to bring us into the breakouts.
Thank you, Drew. I think our team here will set us up for breakout rooms for the PAC members, and also the same sort of discussion questions that we're asking the PAC's input on. We want to discuss with those of you who are here as members of the public as well. So there'll be also a breakout room for you folks who are joining as members of the public, and we'll talk about the same topics and answer your questions. Before we go through those questions, are there Paige, was there anything that we need to do before we move on to an overview of the breakout rooms? I'm seeing not.
Hi, Rachel. We do have a few minutes if the PAC members specifically have some clarifying questions, not comments, because we can get to those in the breakouts, but any clarifying questions that might be helpful for us to discuss with the whole room right here, just before we jump into breakouts. So I think if Abe can open the chat for our PAC members to ask any questions if they have any, I think this would be a good time.
Yes, and it looks like Haley has raised her hand, and Haley.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great.
Go ahead. Okay. I just wanted to confirm that the chart that had the trips, if you could go back to it, that is in the area at the time, at the, within the pricing zone at peak hour.
Peak period, yes.
Or peak period, yeah. And can you remind me when peak period is?
Yeah, so we have a 3 hour, there's a 3 hour morning and a 3 hour evening peak, and this is the total of both of those things. So the morning is 6 to 9 a.m. and the evening is 3:30 to 6:30 p.m.
Thank you.
And Wendy asked, I think you went through this, but maybe just sum it up the sum up. How does the current population decline compare with the two previous recessions?
Well, so we don't know yet. So what we've done is there was a declining population. The population was declining leading into the recession. And so we basically assumed that trend doubled going into 2020 and then grows from there. So population is down about a percent. And then we assume that it grows at a rate of about 0.7% every year for the next 5 years.
And it looks like one more from Roland. He's asking a question about our work from home assumption, I think is what he means when he says Salesforce developments. And that was an announcement by Salesforce that they're expecting to maintain work from home policies for a significant portion of their workforce. And maybe just remind everyone about what recommendation we're making to assume here for work from home in the future.
Yeah, so we are assuming that there are a group of people who have the technical ability, or like their jobs allow them to work from home and they can effectively do that. And that group of people is about 54% of the workers in San Francisco. So the assumption that we're making is that of that set of workers, about half the time they'll be working from home. So, so a way to think of that is that on a typical day, about 73, 75% of workers are going to the office and 25% aren't across all workers.
And a last question from Matthew. How are you factoring in expanded federal support for public transit? Is there a scenario that would include more funding than business as usual? Well, the recent federal stimulus has allowed Bay Area operators, including Muni, to maintain their budgets. So that's good news. Of course, we don't know beyond the current stimulus that have been approved, whether there's anything beyond that will be approved. So we have not assumed that. What we have assumed is that there's enough funding to get us back to where we would have been. Maybe Drew, I think describe quickly again the 5-year setback assumption that we're making. And then I don't know, Paige will let me know when we need to move on. Oh, Peter.
Yeah. So the assumption that we've made, which again comes with a big asterisk next to it, is that basically by 2025 we'll get back to where we were 5 years ago. And in addition to that, we'll have the big projects that are under construction. Transit service, as this question hits on, is our understanding of how that future could look is rapidly changing, and we're talking to folks at MTA and other operators to see if there are better assumptions that we should be making here.
Yeah, let me ask for Peter, because I apologize, I didn't see your hand raised. And then I think a lot of the comments that are coming through are really good, the kind of feedback that we want to hear. So I think when we break out into discussion rooms, we can really get into all of those thoughts. So Peter, yeah, please, what's your question or comment?
Yes, thank you. I think your assumptions overall are very reasonable. But one thing that we've also seen over the years is a spreading of the peak, especially among auto trips, where the peak used to be 2 hours and now it's done 2.5 and 3 hours. And I think it's even more than that, been more than that on the Bay Bridge. As trip demand decreases, if that happens, I think, it seems reasonable to expect that the peak might become more compressed again, so that the amount of congestion at the height of the peak would be higher than it would be with a broader peak. Is that something that you've considered at all in your analysis? Does that seem reasonable?
That does seem reasonable, and we've actually looked at some information about this, and you're right that what's happening right now is that the peak period has narrowed, and it has also, like, the depth of it has also lessened. So there's what we're looking at right now is a shorter and less severe peak period, and so it is totally reasonable to expect that as congestion and traffic comes back, that peak will again get worse, and then as it gets unbearable, will spread again.
All right. Thank you, folks. Paige, is it time for us to move into breakout rooms?
Yes, let's do it. So I will go ahead and break everyone into breakout rooms. As a reminder to PAC members, if you have more than one person representing your organization, you'll want to designate one person to go into the breakout rooms today. And then the rest of the public here will stay in the main room with Rachel and me for a discussion on the same questions that the PAC members will be discussing in breakout rooms. I apologize if I forget you, so we'll do a check to see if we have any lingering PAC members after I do the breakout rooms. And all right, see you all soon. Great, so is there anyone here who's a PAC member who should be in a breakout room? That's probably a good first question for us.
James. Oh, maybe James went.
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right, great. I also have here, I see there are some folks from MTA. Here as well, Mari Hunter is our key point of contact with SFMTA as a partner on this study, and she is here with us as well in case of questions for her. So I guess what I wanted to start with, and thank you all for being here as members of the public. Wanted to start with any sort of key reactions or key thoughts based on what we just shared about assumptions of what the world might be in 2025. Any reactions that anyone would want to share?
I'll speak. I'm Charlie Perkins. I'm a San Francisco resident. I think that this entire project is pretty premature right now. I don't think there's any question that the paradigm that we're all used to in terms of the workplace environment and the commute to work is going to be radically different going forward. I think your 50% work from home estimation is low. I mean, is high. I think it's going to be a lot, or is low. I think a lot more people are going to work from home. I spent an hour and a half in a meeting at my government employer today, which employs like 700 people in San Francisco. And the discussion was, do we shift to permanent work from home 5 days a week after the pandemic ends, or 1 day in the office, or 2 days in the office? And we have many, many discussions about the need to be competitive and keep up with the tech firms that are letting permanent work from home going forward in perpetuity. And I am convinced that this problem of too much traffic is solved, at least for the foreseeable future. And I think the whole idea of charging drivers to go to downtown should be tabled. Let a couple years go by, let 3 years go by, 2-3 years, then evaluate the landscape, see if there's a problem at that point. And if there is, then revisit it and bring it up again. But to just like right now, with such uncertainty, to say like, okay, we're going to start charging drivers to drive into downtown, that suggests to me that there's a different agenda here than simply trying to alleviate congestion, which I hope is not the case.
Right. No, it's not. I just do want to be clear. Thank you, Charlie. No, we definitely would not implement congestion pricing now under these conditions. Absolutely not. So I do want to make that sure that is known. And I think, in fact, what you're describing, which is to wait a few years and see what things look like, makes sense. And let me call on Chris now, because he's got his hand raised, which is helpful. If folks who want to make a comment or ask a question can raise your hands. Chris.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Okay,
great. First, I just want to second everything that Charlie just said. I'm sure that you're all familiar with the buzzword term urban geography or urban economic geography, right? And I think that it's really important to note that we can't just compare this to previous recessions, because the urban economic geography is going to change. And we really can't know yet what those outcomes are, because it's the shift toward either hybrid or permanent work from home is going to have such far-reaching and complex effects that it's going to be really hard even to model until we're into it. So I agree with Charlie that a lot of caution is warranted. In terms of the actual forecasting methodology, as I say, I don't think that it's right necessarily to just average the pieces of the previous two recessions, because of that exact issue, that it's that sort of hides what's actually going on and what's actually driving these population trends and these employment pattern trends. So I get that you're probably a little bit under-resourced in terms of being able to do forecasting, but I'm not sure that the methodology you've used, at least for the employment and the population growth, are necessarily great. The other thing is I do some transportation modeling myself, and I would just note that the average metric is incredibly misleading. It's really like when you talk about like SFO over the course of a year has average delays of like 10 minutes. And that doesn't sound that bad, but I think we all know that in reality, that is actually quite bad. When you actually experience it, it's quite a bit different. So I would ask to maybe revisit those metrics, because they don't actually communicate something that's intuitive to the public, or even to most industry experts. Those are my comments on the modeling. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you. I appreciate that. I think I saw a hand from someone whose phone number I now don't see. Let's see. Someone whose phone number ends in 0101. And please, phone caller, please do share your name with us so we can capture you in our notes.
Hi, Grace, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So my name is Zach Dykes-Gross. I'm born and raised in San Francisco and live in District 11 now. Unlike the previous two callers, I I personally don't think we're in for the kind of death of cities and death of cars or congestion. But I think that what I want to emphasize otherwise is that we're talking about something 5 years away. So I do hear the concerns that like congestion may not be as bad then, but in my opinion, we will have ample other opportunities if we're seeing these trends are not similar to past and that there are these pretty significant differences, that we'll have other opportunities going forward to dial back this program or delay it further then, I think. But the flip side of that is if we do not move forward with this now and congestion does come back, we risk a really bad situation that hurts drivers and transit users and everyone here in San Francisco. And so in my mind, the consequences of not moving forward with this, given that uncertainty, are much higher than the consequences of stopping and delaying now. I'll remind that we've already done 1 or 2 other congestion pricing studies here in the city already and have not moved forward. And that's partially why we're in the mess we're in the first place when it comes to COVID pre-COVID congestion. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you for hearing me out. We should have a degree of caution about this, but I don't think that is a barrier to moving forward.
Okay, thank you for calling in. I see Mary's hand. So we'll hear from Mary, then Stephen Tabor, and then Mike E.
Thank you, Rachel. I really appreciated the comments of the first 2 speakers. I think what we're looking at in the future is very different from previous recessions. This is not like a market-caused recession, and it's triggering a fundamental change in the way people are going to be working in the future. And my biggest concern in the next 5 years is how do we get our city back? How do we get back a vibrant city where people are out on the streets engaging? And really fundamental to that is the health of the business community. And I think no matter what you do with congestion pricing, it's going to have an impact on the business community. And I think that, the MTA and the city's goal right now should be on how do we bring back the health of our small businesses and bring back that vibrant city life, which is what we all love about San Francisco. And I just don't see this supporting it right now. Maybe in the future. Yeah, thank you,
Mary. Thank you, Mary. Stephen T.
Yes, I am the transportation chair of Russian Hill Neighbors, and I have just gotten involved in this project belatedly because there has been no outreach to the Northeast neighborhoods of San Francisco, which would be within the congestion pricing zone, but outside the downtown. We have terrible transit in the northeast part of the city. It doesn't move any faster than you can walk. We are working very hard to try to get the central subway extended to North Beach and Fisherman's Wharf. But meanwhile, we are faced with a situation under this proposal where we would be charged a fee to access our own homes and yet not provided adequate transportation so that we could live without a car. So what we need to do is be very careful in structuring this thing. I don't have a problem necessarily with congestion pricing, but my big question is whether we have anywhere near the transportation capacity to offer people an alternative. The City of London has one of these congestion pricing zones, and they have in the central part of London, which is basically a non-residential area, they have 25 tube stations and about half a dozen mainline rail stations serving that small area. Manhattan is another congestion pricing area which covers the entire entirety of Manhattan. It has 151 subway stations within the congestion pricing zone, plus 2 rail stations with numerous lines. We have 5 subway stations in this pricing area, and we will potentially have 7 when the central subway is done. Our part of town, that is the residential areas of places like North Beach, Russian Hill, Telegraph Hill, Fisherman's Wharf, have no subway stations to this extent, have a very poor and inadequate bus service that doesn't carry you faster than you can walk. And we would be subject to this congestion pricing to access our own homes. When a service provider wants to access our homes, they would have to pay the fine and they would pass it on to us. What we want to do is to definitely work towards a transit-oriented city. The problem we have is that we're not anywhere close to that. We have another gripe, and that is that there is no representative of any of the Northeast neighborhoods be mostly affected on the advisory committee for this process. We need to have representation since we're the ones who are going to bear the brunt of this proposal. I'm not saying it's a bad proposal. I'm not saying it wouldn't work. What I'm saying is that we're the ones who are going to pay the penalty by being fined for accessing our own homes. We need to solve that problem, and we need to have a voice in the overall solution.
Thank you, Stephen. I hear you, and you and I talked about your concerns. We hear them, and I know you talked with Paige about them as she hears them. And I know we have a lot of outreach to do with your neighbors and the groups that you emailed us that we received. So thank you for doing that. And I realize that we've got a lot of outreach to do there. So I hear you. We're going to continue the conversation about the concerns that you've raised. I want to ask Mike E, and then Matthew, and then Kimberly.
Rachel, I just wanted to note, if you get to a point where you want to share the slides, I'm unable to do it because I'm doing breakout rooms actually, but you're welcome to. But if not, I think we're doing okay too. Oh,
okay. The slides have some discussion questions on them, don't they? Is that what it is? Yeah. Okay, thank you. See what I can do then.
Hi. I guess one question I could ask is, will you have this? Do you have the slide deck uploaded to your webpage on the schedule entry for this event, or will you have that uploaded?
We will have it after the meeting, as well as the recording of the meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I actually have like 3 questions. The first one, I guess, is sort of, well, it's not really a question so much as a statement on methodology. I would tend to think that you would want to factor in the political climate as well, which means that if you look at the policy convergence between, Obama and Biden, that the recovery should be more like 2008's than 2000's, which means that there should be some improvement, but that might very well be tempered by an increased use of work from home. The second one is, assuming that, say, it's 2026, 2030, and we continue to have Vision Zero problems in the city, and we've tried many strategies to deal with the Vision Zero issue. In other words, people being killed by cars. And things like automated speed enforcement and devolution of speed limits don't come through. You had a slide in the presentation about the speed factor and the fact that we may not have as much congestion as we were originally thinking, but that will probably mean that speeds will be faster. Are you looking at congestion pricing as a way to control speeds? The third question is, I don't know if any of you were at the ABAG MTC meeting this morning, but they were talking about options to maintain and optimize the existing regional transportation system, where congestion pricing on transit available highways were considered. And they put in a cost estimate, and we were passing, me and my circle of invisible oligarchs were passing this paper around and scoffing at the estimate of $1 billion cost of implementation. Have we discussed cost of implementation for the San Francisco project yet?
Only not as much as we will. in the next phase of the study. We've discussed it briefly last fall when we were doing some screening work, and we were looking at a rough order of magnitude just of the ongoing operating cost and sort of what a amortized implementation cost might be to do some basic feasibility screening. However, we need to do more than that. And in this upcoming phase of the study, we will be revising the implementation and operating cost estimate for something like this, depending on how the alternatives that Drew mentioned get modified, through the outreach. And I think you had one question, I think, in there for me, which is about speeds and whether congestion pricing would help manage speeds or is intended to help manage speeds. As part of the goals framework that the PAC adopted, and we talked a lot about speeds and the place of optimizing traffic to help manage speeds. And one thing that congestion pricing can do, and other cities have used it for, is to reduce vehicle demand during peak periods and then use vehicle space for traffic calming and safety improvements. So to expand not just priority treatment for transit, but also safe pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure to improve non-motorized travel safety in places like Soma, which places like the Tenderloin, which have such a significant share of our high injury network streets. Let's see, I think next was Matthew Stafford, then Kimberly, and then Britt.
Awesome. Can you guys all hear me?
Yes.
Hi, also Matt Stafford, resident in North Beach here in San Francisco. Just wanted to say, I think one thing that I think we've all seen during this pandemic is looking at the silver linings, one of them being, I think, these parklets and how we can reappropriate space for pedestrians. It's part of, I think, what a lot of people enjoy about the vibrancy of city life. And one thing that congestion pricing, like you just mentioned, would give us an opportunity to think about is how we can reclaim our space. The vast majority of San Franciscans are using alternative means. I think neighborhoods here in North Beach and Russian Hill, it was about 20% of pre-pandemic were driving alone to work. So that meant the vast majority of people are walking, biking, taking transit. And how can we support that in the recovery? Which I think, I don't ascribe to the doom and gloom that a lot of other people see. I think that there is going to be a swift recovery, and with it, a lot of traffic, and the status quo pre-pandemic was not acceptable downtown with the massive congestion. And so I do think this project should move forward. And especially as more people get vaccinated, people return to the office. So this fall, even just at 75%, it's still a huge amount of people. And if people are driving, it's not going to be sustainable long-term. So thinking about how can we repurpose our streets for the people who are actually taking transit, walking, use it for parklets, use it for just, I think a lot of our urban neighborhoods like in the Tenderloin or in Soma that are very starved for park space. That's a lot of street space that I think could get repurposed, and it's not possible unless we have reduced demand, and the only way we can get that is through congestion pricing. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Matthew, for your comment. So the queue of folks, we have definitely a queue of folks that I'm seeing who are waiting to speak. So I'm going to keep calling on folks who haven't had the chance yet. So next is Kimberly, then Britt, and then Randy. But however, I do want to acknowledge Naz and Jonah, who are also waiting to speak, who I think haven't been able to put their hands up. So we're going to go Kimberly, Britt, Randy, Naz, Jonah.
Are you ready for me?
Yes, Kimberly, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm with the Downtown TMA in San Francisco. last Thursday, we got our 10-year plan to keep offering commuter services to about what was 135,000 people a year ago at this time, working in our 82 member buildings in the financial district and south of Market. We got a 10-year approval of it, but we mainly got it because we did not make assumptions about people returning to work, when it would happen and in what numbers, because of the vast uncertainty right now. So I echo every comment about caution on the projections and moving ahead. And I just had a couple of quick points to make that I think to the gentleman from Russian Hill, he's right that the transit inventory in the city is not equally distributed, and that will cause a problem. I view this as a citywide problem because a lot of people will be crossing that street. And so I think this should really be made a public outreach effort citywide, not just to the downtown areas and people who happen to hear about it. And then the other point I have to make is that regardless of who goes where, when, and in what number, you have homeowners and you have building owners, and this study introduces a huge amount of uncertainty into how they conduct their business if they want to sell a building, buy a building, move into a house. Especially given the numbers, and once it's in place, it's not probably ever going to go away. That I just think the more time dedicated to study and outreach is just absolutely required. And that was my point. Thank you for listening.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Kim. And we appreciate your willingness to help us reach your members, which we need to continue doing and do even more.
Well, thank you. And if there's anything we can do beyond the downtown, let me know. I mean, this is a huge change, and London was completely different the way that was put together. So, okay,
yeah,
thank you
for that. Yeah, thank you for that offer. I will definitely take you up on that. We have here's the list of folks who I know are waiting: Britt, Randy, Naz, Jonah.
Hi, thank you. So I live here in San Francisco as well, down in Bernal Heights, and I just had a couple of questions. First, just in general, where would the money go that congestion pricing raises? I mean, if it goes just back to the city general fund, I don't know if that's the best way to do it, but if it's going to go towards protected bike lanes, more red carpet lanes, get better transit availability around here, and alternative transit, it would really help the city, especially in that downtown area where it's incredibly difficult and dangerous to be riding a bike or a scooter or even walking sometimes. So that'd be interesting. And also, it would be great to hear experiences from other cities that have done it. People have brought up London, I think Stockholm and Milan, and it doesn't seem like these cities have collapsed and businesses have completely shattered and died. So it'd be great to hear what their experiences have been like as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Britt. So we hear sort of universally from our outreach feedback that the revenue should not go into the general fund. It should go back to transportation and improving access to downtown. And through our last round of outreach, far and away, the feedback we heard was improve transit with this revenue, use it to improve transit. Also walking and biking downtown, but predominantly transit, and especially for neighborhoods that don't have such great access by transit to downtown today, and use the transit revenues to address sort of the inequities in transit access. There are other things that revenues can help support, such as I think was it Mary who talked about how do we help downtown thrive? How could these revenues do other things to help downtown businesses thrive, whether it's street safety, whether it's the quality of sidewalks or managing parking. We want to hear your ideas for how the revenue should go to improve conditions. And then if Paige maybe could put, or I will figure out how to put in the chat, a link to some highlights that we put together about what has been the effect of congestion pricing in some of the other cities who have done it. We put that together and it's on our website. So let me put the link in here.
I shared that, Rachel.
Oh, thank you, Paige. Okay, so next we have Randy, then Naz, then Jonah, and then I see, I think John Peck has not spoken yet. So let me get to the folks who haven't spoken yet, and then I'll circle back once everyone has had their chance.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Hi, so my name is Randy. I am a native San Franciscan. I do live here. Some of my concerns about this pricing congestion for parking, where are the homeowners going to go? That's why most of the people are leaving San Francisco, because we have no say anymore in any of our properties. Just recently, SFMTA took over the parking space in front of my house, painted it red. Nobody considered talking to us. We do have people who are disabled in the house. Now we're out of a parking space. Parking's so limited in San Francisco, and they don't consider people with disabilities.
Okay. I hear you, Randy. I hear you, especially about consultation. And that it was also a theme that a number of you have been emphasizing, is the need for outreach and talking with folks within the zone, without the zone, throughout the city. I hear you on that. Let's see, next was Naz, then Jonah, and then I also see entering the queue, or have entered the queue here, are Alice and Craig after John. So let's see, I think Naz, you're next.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Lovely. Sorry, I joined the meeting a little bit late because I was in another meeting. I hope I didn't miss what I'm going to ask or acknowledge. I am a board member at Mission Merchant Association. I'm a small business advocate and have a background as a server and a bartender for a decade in San Francisco. I'm here to advocate for small businesses as well as working class people. You know, we have I worked in downtown for many years, from bars to ballrooms and all of that. And a huge population of our workers do commute to the city with cars to come to work. And they do need to pay a lot of fees for parking already. And so I just don't think it's really fair for workers, specifically in service industry and entertainment industry, to pay a fee to get to downtown if they don't have other means of commuting for whatever reason they have. And so this affects them. And then while it affects them, it also affects small businesses or any type of businesses there, so to speak. So I think if this program is going to move forward, it would be great if we can acknowledge that. And then also we have another group of working class men and women who actually are undocumented. So there is no way for them to like prove who they are and where they work and why they work where they work. So how are we trying to address these issues? I think is a really big question for at least us here in the mission. Thank
you. We agree that those are really important issues that need to be addressed. Let's see. I think next was Jonah, then John, then Alice, then Craig.
So I think I'm gonna start contextually. I've heard some things I really like from people commenting concerns about impacted neighborhoods and impacted communities in terms of income disparity. And, you know, how if you're a working class person, being charged to go downtown feels a lot more punishing than if you're some, you know, suburbanite who has the money to just throw around. I do think that it's important that we think about this now and not necessarily put it off until the future. I think there's no reason we can't come up with a plan that says, this is what congestion pricing looks like in San Francisco, should we want to implement it, and then decide, depending on how things kind of unfold after the pandemic, whether we want to implement it or not. There is possibly a future 20 years down the line where we look back and we say, you know, now that study we did on congestion pricing, that seems like a really good thing to implement. And then we've done all of this research beforehand on how to mitigate impacts on, you know, certain at-risk communities, how to mitigate impacts on certain neighborhoods. And then we just implement it. So I don't think it's necessarily putting it off is a good idea, but I also think that we do have to take a kind of measured step in making sure that we don't negatively impact certain communities that have traditionally been more negatively impacted either by transit deficits. Recently we had the 15 Bayview instated, which I'm very happy to see, but it's true, Russian Hill doesn't have as much transit. So how do we make sure that the negative impacts aren't felt harder by people who live in these underserved neighborhoods?
Thank you, Jonah. Let's see, next is, I believe, John, then Alice, then Craig.
Thanks, Rachel. My name is John Peck. I live and work in San Francisco, and I'm here representing the Gladstone Institutes in Mission Bay. And I have a question. Why does the downtown congestion map extend so far into Mission Bay, where you have UCSF, the medical center, and Kaiser? I'm hoping that the answer is not because of the Warrior Stadium, because the city promised to manage traffic congestion when they sold everybody in the Warrior Stadium. So I'm kind of curious why the map extends so far into Mission Bay.
Yeah, thank you, John. So this is a question that we're continuing to look at, is Mission Bay and the traffic projected there. Our long range projections, so through 2030, project that Mission Bay is going to be one of the greatest traffic growing parts of San Francisco, not because of Warrior Stadium, but because of the other planned approved growth that's happening there. So that's how Mission Bay came to be in the zone to start with. But we've heard a lot of feedback, including from Gladstone, that this needs to be taken another look at, and can ask the question, well, what is the difference having Mission Bay in the zone or not in the zone and the performance of the program? And we hear that question, and that is absolutely something we're looking at.
Thank you.
So Rachel, you went mute, but I think I'm up next. This is Alice.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I did go mute. Yes, Alice, you're right.
No worries. I just wanted to know if there was any analysis done on the air quality changes. I want to make sure that that doesn't get lost in the equation, because it is in our area. I live in South Beach, and we're in one of the worst air quality zones. So it's definitely a factor of interest to us. And I was curious, of the existing scenarios, I thought that each one predicated the implementation of congestion pricing on a 25% increase in transit service. And if that's the case, is that across the board? Is that for the more underserved areas? I just think that that should be made clear, that pricing shouldn't start until there are, workable alternatives for people. And then the last thing is, if I read correctly on your project site, isn't there a 2 to 3 year window once scenarios are settled upon to go through all of the state legislation and so on and so forth? And if that's the case, I think it should always be made clear on your timeline. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That good point. So yes, that is right. Congestion pricing is something that would take a lot of steps beyond just this study if the city wanted to continue pursuing it. And that does include state authorizing legislation, which is a significant step. So we project it would take at least 3-5 years, even if the city said after this study, we'd like to continue developing it. So let's see, next is Craig. then Liz. And then we might be able to go back to a second question.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, my name's Craig. I'm a taxi driver. I've been driving 20 years in San Francisco. And I can tell you the worst traffic, regular traffic in San Francisco is from April until October. And it's when the Giants play Monday through Friday. And if I'm just wondering if there's any other city that has downtown ballparks that have been able to do some kind of congestion pricing built specifically around when the teams play. That's all. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think John brought up the Warriors before this, and they have a very robust, as he referred to, TDM, travel demand management plan, but it's not, I think it uses parking pricing, but not any sort of street congestion pricing. No city that I'm aware of has it just for sports. Let's see.
Let me just, our city is particularly impacted because of the proximity to the Bay Bridge and the fact that the Giants, if they play a 1 o'clock game and lets out about 4 o'clock rush hour, or they play a 7 p.m. game at night, it's still right around rush hour. And it makes traffic horrendous. I don't even want to drive at those times because, you know, I like having the Giants, but I don't want to even be on the road and be called to a downtown ride just because it's literally a nightmare.
Okay, I got you. Let's see, Liz is next, and then we can go back to folks who have their hands raised, who've spoken before.
Yeah, hi, Rachel. This is Liz Hirschhorn. I'm calling as a citizen here. I live downtown, and I do agree with most of the comments that have been made that we should proceed with caution. I think it's really unknown what the rebound will be after COVID. But my main comment is I would like to suggest that for those people that we're targeting for this congestion pricing, it seems to me that that is for people that are coming from outside the city, driving into the city. I don't know, at least from the downtown perspective, most of the traffic jams seem to be accessing the bridge. And so if there's some way to put an exemption or reduced pricing for residents, and like in my own case, I have a car, but I choose to walk and take transit everywhere, except when I have to drive to work, and then I would be paying to come back into my hometown. So that's the main comment, is to consider reducing for residents and really targeting this congestion pricing on those that are causing congestion from the outside. And then last comment, I'd like to say, you know, it is seemingly contingent on improving transit, but the way that Market Street was done, for instance, my own experience has been that it's just downright scary walking on Market Street these days. There are no cars, transit only, which I assume has improved the transit performance. But from an experiential perspective, it's just a ghost town, and all of the vibrancy and people going to businesses is gone. And I, walk with, great awareness now on the street, and that's not just COVID. That change on Market happened pre-COVID. So I just would like to also suggest that improving transit should be in an integrated fashion with bikes and peds as well, and not just transit only stretches. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. And so you bring up a couple of good points here. One about residents. And so one of the things we've recommended in the scenarios based on our outreach feedback is that there should be, first of all, an exemption for anyone who's a Bay Area resident, including a resident of the zone who's very low income. So that would be for residents of the zone and other Bay Area residents. Also, the different discounts for residents and non-residents who are low income, and in two of our scenarios, in the middle income band. So those would be for residents, of lower incomes, and as well as other Bay Area residents. We are also looking at resident discounts for those who are in the high income categories as well, because of the reason that you pointed out, they live within the zone, and we've heard Stevens and others comments along the same lines. We do think, though, that based on our knowledge of travel patterns coming into the city, the queues on the ramps are very visible. But as far as the actual numbers of vehicles circulating or coming into and out of downtown from all directions, 3/4 of them we've found in the downtown area are from San Francisco, somewhere else in San Francisco, or within the zone. Now that does include ride hails circulating around. And that includes ride hails as well. So let's see. So that might be worth. I just want to share that because that was surprising to us as well. Let's see. Next, I think that was everybody who hasn't. Was waiting to make a comment or question. So some folks who have their hands up again are 0101, then Chris, then Charlie, then Craig. Does 0101 caller, would you like to speak? Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, sorry, I didn't have a question. I already spoke.
Oh,
I'm not sure why I'm back in the queue.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. I saw your hand. So let's see, Chris, then Charlie.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak again. I did just want to clarify something from the first time that I spoke, and I don't think that work from home and less crowding downtown is the death of the city. I'm actually quite optimistic about what that means for a changing city that isn't so dependent on people being crowded into one spot. San Francisco in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, would we call that a dying city? I don't think so. So I think it's really important to just try to see things from our point of view, that not everything has to be sardine tin to be vibrant. And in fact, that maybe it's a better thing when our downtown has some space for something less than the what we might call the highest and best use. I do agree that with some of the other speakers who have spoken about transit capacity, I mean, the projects that are on the books right now just aren't enough to make a difference. Geary BRT, I mean, that's a line that serves more people than Caltrain, and just painting some red stripes on the road is does disrespect to the volume of people that serves. I think that what we really need to do is figure out what that regional mass transit plan looks like that actually does give us something more similar to the other world cities that we're comparing ourselves to. That's hundreds of miles of undergrounding, not just a 2-mile central subway that the SFMTA has failed to deliver. And finally, just on the equity point, I know that you've brought up some equity plans, but those are really trying to solve a problem that shouldn't exist. And I have a really big problem with trying to create a system that cross-references your mobility patterns with your income. I mean, that's not only a dream for hackers, but it's going to be something that law enforcement is going to want after for the rest of time. And I know that we have a great state legislature that's trying to slow that down, but we've seen what happens in reality. And finally, just noting that congestion is actually more equitable because it forces Mark Zuckerberg to wait in the same traffic jam that I do. And if you believe that rich people actually have a higher time value of money, it means that they're actually paying more to sit in that congestion. So actually that's the more equitable thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Let's see, Charlie, did you have another comment or question?
Yeah, this sort of dovetails into what Liz and I think the commenter before Liz said, but it's a question and a comment. The question is whether any consideration has been given to the impact on working families of this. And I ask it based on my own experience of raising 2 kids on the west side of San Francisco and sending them to public schools throughout and having to drop them off, always being a public transit rider until I became a parent. And then suddenly I have to get them at Jefferson Elementary for their 8:40 start time and then get to my job downtown at an hour that is acceptable to my employer. And, so I didn't really have any option but to drive. And then, I coached youth baseball in San Francisco Park and Rec League for 8 years. And so, then I got to get off work early and have all my equipment and go straight to practice. So, I mean, we all know San Francisco routinely gets rated the worst family-friendly city of all big cities in the nation. And we all know family after family that flees the city once their kids get of school age or once they start having kids, because the city makes it so incredibly difficult on families. And I based on my own experience, which I think is pretty representative of a lot of the families down there, if I had to get hit with money every time I drove into work, and the only reason I was driving into work was a result of being a father, I would have said, my wife and I have many times, we're sort of on the brink of like, God, should we get out of San Diego or San Francisco? Should we move back to where our family lives in San Diego? Should we move to the suburbs? And we toughed it out. And I want this to be a city of families, not just a bunch of, young bike riding, single tech people, but a place where families can thrive. And I just think that the SFCTA, they seem to have an agenda to not simply promote alternative transportation, but to punish people who drive cars. And I mean, you see it time and again, and you make it harder and harder to get anywhere, to park, and all the while, promote public transit, give people free bikes, give credits to electric vehicles. I have a hybrid. I'm going to get an electric for my next car. Do all the right things, but don't treat drivers as if they're these horrific, terrors behind the wheel who are trying to run down Death Race 2000 bicyclists wherever they can, and who are sitting there burning the environment. Just give families a break. And so if you do have this congestion pricing, I would say anybody who has a child in the family should be exempt.
Thanks, Charlie. Definitely, many people in outreach have pointed out the real challenges of especially school transportation. So we hear that is a reason that we recommend a cap in all of these scenarios, so that nobody, regardless of your income, would be paying multiple times. We are also working in parallel with this with the school district on how to support better transportation for the schools when they revise their the school assignment policies. As you parents here may know, that the school district is revising their assignment policies, and we're working with them to craft transportation recommendations to go along with that to help better support that very challenging school transportation challenge. So I hear you on the problem. Let's see, just want to note from Paige that our breakout rooms will be closing in probably a minute, I think, and we'll be
about now.
Okay.
And I got a DM from Jonah who has one more comment. So Jonah, if you want to go ahead, I'll close the breakout rooms and then people will start coming back in.
I think in kind of context, I've heard a lot of concerns about families I think that a lot of the concerns overall that I've heard sound very similar, especially in kind of the car-centric vision, sound very similar to the kind of concerns that were heard in the 1950s and 70s in the Nordic countries when they made their big swing over to bicycles and really kind of removing space for cars and putting a priority on bike traffic. I think, you know, there's a vision we have of the family person has a car because they need to take kids from point A to point B. But I know people in my neighborhood in Glen Park who they put the kid on the back of the bike and then head off. I don't think a car is necessary. And I think, you know, for those people, having money that then gets funneled into safe, separate bike infrastructure feels a lot better. You know, at some point we have to consider, where does this money go? And if it's to increase active transportation just as much as it is to increase transportation service through buses and metro service, but also protected bike lanes and more pedestrian walking space, I think the advantages outweigh the costs overall.
Okay, thank you, Jonah. And I think we're going to have folks rejoining us now from the breakout rooms, and then from each breakout room, someone will report out on some of the themes of the feedback that we have heard. So let's give a moment for the breakout room folks to return. I can't tell if
everyone's back, Rachel, and
oh,
the breakout room, the report outs, we have about 2.5 minutes for each group to report out.
Okay, is there a person from breakout group 1? Could you designate yourself someone to report out, or maybe the note taker can share some of the themes from your breakout group?
Sure, I'm happy to start us off, and if other folks want to chime in, please go ahead. I think one of the key themes that really emerged from our breakout group is not really, you know, we don't know what the peak period is anymore. So for us to define that at this moment feels very challenging, and we want to make sure that the program is designed in a way that is flexible, and a lot of questions came up around if and how flexibility being built into the program is possible, and really emphasizing the need for that. And I think another key point is that the timeline feels so stretched out already, and you know, knowing how much time will need to go into the legislative process, really emphasizing that we want to continue with moving forward here and don't want to stretch out the timeline any further on this study. I think those are some of the key themes. Paisley or other folks, do you have anything else to add?
Thank you, Emily. Breakout group 2.
So I was staffing breakout group 2, and I can get us started, and folks from my group chime in if I missed anything. So the theme for our group was really think about what a reliable, efficient, safe transit system looks like for San Francisco that needs to be placed as we are recovering, and that really needs to be paired with this congestion pricing program. There were some agreements and disagreements about when the implementation should happen. Folks from my group felt that it could be with a pilot, with a lower fee, with a phased out approach to really get us in the practice of having a congestion pricing, versus really think about the transit options first that needs to be placed before we roll out this program. There is another idea of phasing it in with Uber and Lyft and the TNCs and TNDs to see how that would pan out. But whatever we choose to do, this program should be equitable and should achieve our equity goals. So that was I kind of took out. Anything to share, Brittany, Mel, Chris, Kim, Tiffany?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that we all agreed on was that San Francisco needs to have a much more reliable and much more on time and high quality transit service to begin with. And if we had that similar to New York or similar to a Paris, where it's easy to understand how to get around, it's easy to access, it's on time, there's plenty of capacity for everybody and in all parts of the city, that would be a much stronger solution to congestion than actually trying to penalize people by charging them to drive around the city. So if you give them a really reliable transit system, more people, both rich and poor, will be more inclined to use it versus their private cars. And I think we all agreed that that was probably the biggest takeaway, is that we have a chance now with the pandemic and with the contraction of the transit system, that as it grows up, as it grows out again, expands again, San Francisco has an opportunity to build it out in such a way that it provides much better service to the public of San Francisco and entices them to get out of their cars and into the buses and into the system.
Thanks, Breakout Group 2. Breakout Group 3, do you know who you are?
Yes. So I will try to synthesize what we talked about, and hopefully I won't miss anything. But if I did, feel free, Group 3, to jump in and add anything that I may have missed. So one of the themes was kind of, keeping our eye on impacts, particularly to vulnerable communities, and especially people that live or work or own a small business in downtown and maybe affected more greatly by a program like this. We also heard that it was important to keep our eyes on what's going on with transit to make sure that people have alternatives that work for them before there's any congestion pricing that makes driving less feasible for them. We heard that we should maintain our focus on equity, particularly with respect to price and keeping exemptions and discounts for lower income drivers. And then we heard that phasing in congestion pricing program, starting with a lower price and raising it over time, could be a way to kind of keep a cap on conditions to keep them from deteriorating. But it also might come with some challenges, like people getting used to a lower price and being resistant to raising it. Does anybody else want to add any comments from Group 3?
Okay, Group 4.
I think that's my group.
Go for it, Ezra.
Okay. So with my group, there were some differing thoughts around like the baseline and like, are people really leaving? How fast will we be able to bounce back? So some folks feeling fairly, like unconcerned about it, others more so, and overall kind of like cautious around the predictions. Noting that the wealth gap is huge. So how are we addressing that when we're thinking about things? Small businesses on the edge as well. And then in terms of the implementation timing, I think we had a lot of differing opinions there. I think some folks definitely saying, we already, like it's already needed. So let's not delay this even further because we've been studying this a long time. And in general, it seemed like folks were pretty open or favorable to the idea of having it be rolled out in phases, maybe with lower prices earlier and then going up over time, both so that we can implement earlier, but also to minimize like sticker shock, et cetera. And And then also hearing from some folks, we really need the economy to be on a much better footing to be able to implement. So a lot of different opinions around that. In terms of like the program design itself, people were wanting to hear about the deliveries, the delivery, like the, I don't know, like Uber food and things like that, and how that's going to be factored into this. But overall, it seems like folks are viewing this as primarily a way to cut down on congestion and allow transit to go smoother, and less as much about reinvestment, but also want that as well, because the kind of baseline understanding with the group was transit is not good enough right now for people who really need it. So in terms of safety and capacity. And then in terms of what folks want to see moving forward, as we move towards the recommendation, it was just a lot of comments around making sure that we keep reaching out to neighborhood organizations, we keep providing like accessible and easy to engage community outreach.
Thank you, Ezra. And in the group, I was with everyone from who was members of the public, and a lot of the same, I think we probably covered all of those same things in the conversation with members of the public. That was everyone, right, Paige? And I think
one more.
Oh, I'm sorry, Brooke.
No problem. Yeah, so group 5, I'll get us started and other folks can chime in afterwards. But similar to you, Rachel, some of the themes that came up in other groups also came up for us. So making sure, to continue to check our assumptions about when a peak period might be, what future travel behavior might look like, making sure to zoom out a little bit as we ask these questions, and also to not lose sight of questions that have continued to come up around, what if congestion reduces and travel speeds are increasing, what happens for safety, and flagging that issue. And in terms of implementation timing, we had a really interesting discussion. There's a lot of thoughtfulness around the economy and how we think about the indicators, maybe that the relationship between congestion and the economy, especially for businesses in the downtown corridor, might be different. Like noticing that perhaps congestion might come back faster than the recovery does, and making sure we think about those things. But also, making sure to keep equity in mind by thinking about not just the economy, but also like who is traveling by what mode, and the balance between transit use and driving, and not abandoning the potential mindset shift of, charging for roads as well as charging for transit and the implications of that. In terms of balancing benefits, folks were noting that, obviously the price and the revenue are both important, but maybe it's not as much of a trade-off as we think, given that there are some interventions around bikes, et cetera, that may cost less. And, folks had some interesting thoughts about short-term versus long-term implementation. There were some different opinions about, the potential of implementing congestion pricing in a preventative way, and like having some benefits of doing it before it comes back, versus making sure to only implement it when congestion is reappearing and having that validity quite evident. But there was some interest in a phased-in approach, even just from the perspective of the required behavior change and getting used to things like we've all had to get used to wearing masks, and giving folks a chance to kind of have an adjustment period and get used to the idea before raising the price more in the future. And so in terms of deal makers and deal breakers, making sure we think about equity, especially for folks who need to drive, commute into San Francisco for various reasons, and maybe low income and don't have a choice. But there were some different opinions about timing and the nature of that, and impacts on yeah, related to the presence of congestion in the economy as well. Anything I missed, group?
If I can chime in real quick, and thank you, Brooke, for doing all that. A simple layout, you know, the convoluted map, convoluted system, a lot of complexities can be a turnoff, a frustration, and a misunderstanding, which will just lead to more frustration. So, you know, the boundaries need to be simpler, the rules need to be simpler. People need to be able to walk in and understand this relatively quickly.
Thanks, Mario.
That's a good point, Mario. Okay, thank you, everyone. So a couple more things that we'd like to cover before we wrap up tonight. I know Paige wants to give some updates on outreach because we do have another major citywide and also regional round of outreach that we have yet to do for this study. And I can also share some of our other next steps on technical work and analysis work as well, and sort of what the next steps look like. Paige, I think this is where I hand it over to you.
Yeah, Drew, I think you might still be our screen sharer if you're available. Can you share slide 35, please?
You bet. One moment.
Sort of the some key things to know is that we had a sort of very focused, intensive round of outreach last fall. We are planning for this next round of outreach to also be socially distanced and remote, because we don't know how the vaccine rollout is going to go. So we're assuming that, and we'll be spending a lot of time later this spring going back into conversations with the community.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and similar, kind of going from what Rachel said, we are going to be conducting that second round of outreach in a similar way that we did the first round due to shelter in place. It'll be happening primarily this April and May, a little bit into June potentially, and our main goal is to meet people where they are as best as we can during shelter in place. So we've developed some goals that mirror some of the outreach that we did in this first round. That includes at least 20 remote co-creation workshops hosted in partnership with community-based organizations, at least half of which will be in language, at least 3 digital and/or telephone town halls, hosting roundtables with the business and labor communities, reaching out to our list of over 400 San Francisco and regional stakeholders to schedule at least 60 stakeholder meetings, getting at least 1,000 responses to our digital and text surveys, and conducting custom outreach as needed. Just one example of that is that we partnered with Self-Help for the Elderly in this past round to reach out to their WeChat groups to help get the word out. Next slide, please. And as a reminder, I mentioned co-creation workshops are going to be one of the things that we'll be doing. And in that first round, it was one of the real focal points of our outreach, and it will be this second time as well. And as part of these workshops, participants collaborate to design an equitable congestion pricing program and give us feedback. So in these workshops that we conduct remotely, our team works closely with community organization co-host partners to set the workshops up, primarily focused on reaching low-income communities, communities of color, and other historically underrepresented groups. The participants will join either via video conference like Zoom or just a phone call, depending on what level of digital access they have. And in most cases, participants join separately from Zoom at home, but this one example here on the slide is a photo from a workshop we held with Chinatown Community Development Corporation, which is also one of our PAC members, at an affordable housing location in Mission Bay, where the participants wanted to conduct a workshop with us from a well-ventilated community room wearing masks. And in all of these outreach events, we send folks packets in the mail. So they have a participation packet that they can see the materials right in front of them, and they talk with us either on the phone or on the video. And next slide, please. So how do we get the word out about all of these opportunities to get feedback, whether it be co-creation, whether it be a town hall or a survey? So similar to our outreach in round one, we'll be using posters, flyers, and in-language media advertisements, engagement with community-based organizations, earned media, social media, and more. And I'll drop our outreach synthesis into the chat from our first round so you can learn more about the tools that we used in round one and the synthesis that came out from that first round, so you can get an idea of what we'll be doing in the second round. And I'll leave it up to Rachel for that next slide to close us out with the timeline.
Yes, thank you. And then after that, we go to public comment. So we are in step 5 right now. And step 5 does include a analysis of these 3 different scenarios against the goals and objectives and performance metrics that the PAC adopted early on in the study. So we'll be using these assumptions about 2025 conditions that Drew described, but also bearing in mind that things could go in many different directions. There's a range of futures that we might see, but bearing that in mind, look at what might be the different trade-offs, relative benefits, effects, how do people change their behavior, and who pays, and how do people's costs change, all of those performance measures. And then share those findings through outreach and hear feedback on, in light of these projections about how the scenarios might perform, how do we get from there to a recommendation? And after that outreach, we'll come back to this body with the findings, what we've heard, and how what we've heard might shape a draft recommendation. And so we'll want to hear from you feedback on a draft recommendation. We expect that there'll be feedback. We'll present it to our board as well and hear their feedback and come back in step 6, likely after the board's recess in August. Our board has a recess in August. After that, with revised recommendations based on what we've heard for our board to consider as adoption. So those are our next steps. And I think now we want to allow for comments and other thoughts from members of the public while the PAC is here. And we'll go to that. And I think to make sure that everybody who wants to can speak, will allow for 1 minute. And if someone wants to speak, if you would raise your hand, that would, I think, be the easiest way for me to make sure that I can spot you. And it looks like, Chris, were you raising you're the first hand I saw, but I'm not sure if that hand was there from before. Chris, did you want to make a comment?
And Rachel, just
yes,
to
please.
interrupt real quick.
Oh, sorry.
If you don't mind, sorry. Abe is going to pull up the public comment timer so we can all see the 1 minute mark.
Thank you, Abe.
And as a reminder to anybody on the phone, if you'd like to raise your hand, you can dial *9.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes. Okay.
1 minute will begin now.
All right, Chris, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. We had a really great breakout session, and I'm sure that all of that feedback will be summarized. So I won't go into detail, but I will note, as the panel is online, that the conversations that we had were very different from what we've heard in the report outs from your groups, and a lot of different concerns. We didn't talk at all about things like phasing in. We talked more about the fundamental feasibility and desire for the program. I think where we did agree is that transit improvements need to come first. Finally, thanks, Drew, for walking us through your presentation. And I would just ask that in the future that you don't use average travel speeds as a metric, as those tend to be really unintuitive and hard for somebody to actually understand what a 1 mile an hour change means. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I think next I saw Charlie.
Yeah, I would agree with Chris that the report back on the public breakout session wasn't completely full, I guess, didn't fully capture. But although there were dissenting voices, I think the loudest voice that we heard was that people should take a breath and maybe slow down, pause. The work environment, the projections that 50% of the people are going to return to the office may be right. I personally think that they're inflated, that it's going to be less than that based on my own 800 employer in San Francisco's take on things, government employer at that. And so, you know, seeing all these next steps, we're going to go all guns a-blazing. I mean, it looks to me like, unless this is like fait accompli, that maybe, which it may well be, I kind of get the sense it probably is as far as SF CTA is involved, or whatever the acronym is. We really think that it's not ripe right now. It'd be imprudent, in fact, to spend all the resources to proceed further until we see what the landscape looks like 2 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. I just do want to clarify or reassure folks, SFCTA could not just decide to do congestion pricing as a fait accompli. It's not an authority that SFCTA has. Congestion pricing would need state authorization and other approvals. So we very much are seeking to incorporate feedback that we hear into what a congestion pricing program might look like. And bring that for our board's consideration. So please be reassured, it couldn't be a fait accompli. Is there anyone else from the public who would like to speak? I'm not seeing any hands, but I might be missing. Yeah.
Yeah, our PAC member, Robin, would like to make comment, actually.
Robin, please.
Okay, Paige, thank you very much. So just when we were talking in our group about equity, something crossed my mind. You know, we're sort of concerned about the low-income person who might be driving their car from Tracy, and yet we forget about the low-income marginalized people who live in the areas where these people drive through. People in the Tenderloin and Soma and in the Bayview and the freeway corridors where all this traffic is moving through and affecting their health. So I think I just want to mention that when we consider congestion, when we're thinking about congestion pricing and we want to be equitable and we want to think about marginalized communities, we should also think about the health and safety of the people who live in these communities where all this traffic is passing through. So I just want to put that out there.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Is there anyone else who would like to offer a comment during public comment who hasn't spoken? I am not seeing hands. Mary, please.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I haven't had time to prepare my thoughts here, but I hear a lot about the impact of this pricing to low-income families, and I am totally sympathetic and supportive of like making sure that our underrepresented communities are considered in this pricing. I come from a middle-class family. We were not wealthy, but we did not qualify as low income. I raised a family here. I had a special needs child. I had a husband with medical issues. You need to think about the broader community when you think about the impact of this pricing, because it's not just low income families who are going to be affected by this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Is there anyone else who would like to offer a public comment? We expect the next meeting of the PAC to be this summer after we finished outreach. So that will be June or July. We want to be able to conduct the outreach before we come back to you all so that we can share what we've heard. And so we'll be in touch to schedule that in the coming months. I'm not seeing any other hands for public comment tonight. So with that, I will thank all of you again for your participation tonight. Welcome to the new members of the PAC. Thank you for joining us in the midstream here and for jumping on board and getting up to speed and participating. And we look forward to the outreach that we're going to be doing with hopefully all of you the coming spring. And so we will be in touch. And thank you again for taking the time out to give us your feedback.
Thank you, everyone, all the staff. Thank you very, very much. For really
Okay, bye-bye.
And we'll
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Hi all.